Have you ever loved someone who suddenly rewrote the rules of your marriage without asking for your signature? That's what happened when Mara told Ethan she wanted an open marriage. But what began as healthy exploration soon unraveled into lies, late nights, and a secret life she thought she could hide forever. This isn't just another cheating story. It's a tale of betrayal, silence, and a revenge that didn't need shouting to burn everything down. Stay with me until the end, because the twist is one you won't forget. Welcome to Cheating Stories 7. Don't forget to like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more shocking, true-to-life stories. Now, let's step into the drama of she wanted an open marriage, I ghosted her and took my revenge. I used to measure our marriage by the hums and rhythms of the house. The washing machine thumped with its uneven rhythm. The fridge breathed like a weary animal, and the hallway clock stitched the evenings together with patient ticks. In those familiar sounds, Mara's laugh used to live. It settled into the air with the smell of simmering pasta, late-night reruns, and the tapping of our dog's nails across the hardwood floor, a rhythm that felt like ours alone. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday, Mara set her mug down and said she wanted to open the marriage. There was no build-up, no warning, just a sentence laid down on the table as casually as if she were passing me the salt. I waited for her smile, the punchline that would reveal this was a joke, but none came. Her eyes were calm, too calm and rehearsed. She called it healthy exploration, a way to keep things fresh. Her tone was careful, the same kind of clinical reassurance a doctor gives when recommending exercise. It sounded reasonable, confident, and memorized. "It's a no for me," I answered. My voice stayed steady because I didn't want anger to disguise itself as conviction. "We made promises. Whatever needs fixing, we fix here between us." She nodded slowly, as if I had just confirmed what she already suspected. "Everyone I know is more adventurous," she said softly. "It's not about love, it's curiosity." Then she let fall a soft rain of references, co-workers who make it work, podcasts that normalize it, friends of friends whose marriages supposedly got stronger. Each example was less a suggestion and more like a receipt for something she had already purchased. I didn't moralize. I offered her something else, a map that stayed inside our borders. I reminded her of the trips we had postponed, the rituals we hadn't yet tried, the nights that ended too often on the same couch. I promised that if we wanted adventure, it didn't need to wear someone else's face. "Adventure isn't a third person," I said. "It's us refusing to calcify." She smiled with her mouth but not with her eyes. "Maybe," she murmured, and it sounded less like possibility and more like delay. Days passed, the clock kept stitching, and she returned to the subject, as though my refusal were a delay rather than a decision. She wore a new perfume that arrived without explanation. She laughed at her phone, flipping it face down as if even the light spilling out might betray her. "Is this about someone?" I asked carefully on the 10th day, my words chosen as if they were glass I might shatter by accident. She blinked, just a beat too long, and shook her head. "No, I'm just bored. I want to feel wanted again." There are truths that hide behind other truths, and I heard both. I could have demanded her phone, demanded a name, demanded confession to tame the chaos in my chest, but instead I chose boundaries. "I won't share my marriage," I told her, voice steady. "If something's wrong, tell me. If something's missing, we build it here." She shrugged. It was soft, casual, and lethal all at once. "We'll talk later," she said, clearing plates as though dishes could close a subject. That night I lay awake while the house pretended it was fine. The fridge's hum seemed too loud, the rain against the window ticked like anxious fingers, and I remembered the boy I used to be, confusing chaos for charisma, and the man I had tried to become, one who understood the difference between adrenaline and intimacy. I wasn't afraid of adventure. I was afraid of lies wearing adventure like perfume. When morning arrived, her phone buzzed face down on the counter, vibrating a rhythm that didn't belong to our home. I didn't touch it, not because I didn't care, but because order mattered more than impulse, proof before rage, precision before noise. In the shower, I made a quiet plan. I would not accuse without evidence. I would not erupt with theater or shouting. If a storm was coming, I wanted to know its shape before it arrived. My first act of revenge would be absence, not silence born of weakness, but silence chosen as discipline. When I stepped into the kitchen, her mug still held the ghost of tea. The dog nudged my leg for breakfast. The hallway clock ticked steadily, a heartbeat refusing to quicken for drama. I fed the dog, washed the mug, and opened the morning news on my phone. If ordinary life could be rebuilt, I would do it with steady hands. The house seemed to cooperate. It waited with me. It breathed with me. In the days that followed, silence became a language of its own. I watched how easily routines bent without breaking, how life could look familiar on the surface while something underneath shifted dangerously. Mara's schedule changed in increments so small they almost passed as normal. At first, it was 2 late nights a month, then 2 a week. Each absence was tied neatly to an Asian client, whose hours, apparently, demanded midnight sacrifices. She spoke of promotion path projects, dinners with partners whose names I had never heard. A new perfume clung to her coats before I had ever seen a receipt. I asked her gently if she was overworked, hoping my concern might reach the place we used to meet in honesty. Her reply was sharp, defensive. She accused me of being rigid, of clinging to outdated ideals, of killing spontaneity. The words cut deeper than the accusation itself, because once she had called my steadiness a gift. Now that steadiness had become her evidence against me. Instead of fighting, I turned inward. I began counting my own flaws like beads on a rosary. Had I become predictable? Did my patience masquerade as neglect? Once, this kind of self-examination had been a strength in our marriage, a tool that helped me grow. Now it felt like camouflage, a way to hide wounds I didn't want to admit were bleeding. But doubt wasn't enough. Quietly, I decided to record what was happening, not for spectacle, not for confrontation, but for truth. I started with small notes. The time she left, the time she returned, grocery receipts that showed purchases she couldn't have made during the hours she claimed to be in meetings. At night, I photographed the odometer in her car before I slept, then again at dawn. Each entry was small, almost laughable in isolation, but together they began to sketch a pattern that I couldn't ignore. Her laughter no longer belonged to our home. It rang brighter, louder, whenever her eyes were fixed on her phone. Compliments from her came sparingly, hollow acknowledgments given like receipts rather than gifts of affection. When I suggested counseling, she scoffed and called it Victorian nonsense. I didn't argue. Instead, I turned to the traces she left behind, calendar gaps that didn't match her explanations, text alerts from the bank at odd hours, rideshare receipts showing pickups far from her office. Thin evidence, yes, but each fragment was another raindrop, and I could feel the storm gathering. Patience, I told myself, was not passivity. I wasn't waiting to catch her once, to corner her with a single night's betrayal. I was charting a climate, mapping a system that repeated itself. Because when the time came to act, I wanted to know not just the incident, but the pattern, the shape of the storm she had chosen to walk into. And in the quiet of those nights, while the fridge hummed and the clock stitched the dark, I realized something else. Her betrayal was no longer just an intrusion. It had become routine. Her transformation didn't arrive overnight. It unfolded in layers so gradual that a stranger might not have noticed. But I had lived too close to her rhythms to miss the shift. The first fracture appeared in language. Words like vibe and low-key started slipping into her sentences, borrowed from the interns she was mentoring at work. Soon after, her wardrobe followed suit. Heels gave way to sneakers with neon laces, tailored blazers replaced by cropped jackets that whispered more about rooftop bars than boardrooms. Weekends grew louder too. She came home electric, her stories pulsing with a new tempo. Rooftop parties, late-night karaoke in forgotten warehouses, curated adventures that her younger colleagues narrated like conquests. She laughed when she told me that marriage adds 10 years for every anniversary. "So technically, you're already 52, she teased, swirling wine in her glass. The words wore the costume of humor, but I could hear how neatly they fit into her new narrative. Youth equals freedom, stability equals age. I didn't argue. I let her words land, sharp as they were, and chose silence over sermon. What she wanted wasn't simply to feel desired. It was to feel 22 again, to be applauded in a room that hadn't yet learned the weight of responsibility. One Friday, I agreed to join her crowd. Curiosity outweighed pride, and I needed to see the orbit she had chosen. That was the night I met Tyler. He was everything the interns admired, charming, reckless, drenched in cologne, and utterly unbothered by consequence. When he clasped my shoulder, he called me sir. The word dripped with sugar, but beneath it lay venom. Mara laughed at his remark, too brightly, too quickly, and I saw in her eyes the glimmer of approval she had once reserved for me. In that moment, the boundary cracked wide open. She wasn't just curious. She was auditioning for a role in their shallow theater, one where excitement was traded for discretion, flattery for financial cushioning. Authenticity was their mantra until the bill arrived, until the lights came up and responsibility tapped them on the shoulder. I watched it all in silence. I took in the rhythm of their exchanges, the shallow economy of attention and approval, and I understood something essential. This wasn't romance. It wasn't even desire. It was culture, loud, temporary, disposable. And I knew with a clarity that would serve me later that Mara wasn't swept into a love affair. She was seduced by applause, by the stage lights of youth she no longer owned. Tyler was less a lover than a mirror, reflecting back to her the version of herself she was desperate to believe still existed. That night, I didn't confront her. I didn't drag her from the noise. I simply watched, cataloging every detail, storing it like evidence. Because one day in court or in memory, I would need to remember the difference between intimacy and performance, and I would not let her rewrite the script. The evening began with the kind of hope only a husband still willing to try could summon. I left work earlier than usual, stopped by her favorite deli, and brought home the pasta she always said comforted her after long days. I set the table with quiet care, a candle lit, 2 glasses of wine poured, the kind of small ritual I believed could remind us of what still lived between us. At 7 o'clock, Mara texted that she would be working late. Maybe until 2:30, she wrote, blaming once again the elusive Asian client whose schedule demanded odd hours. I told myself it was fine, that small sacrifices were the price of ambition. By 9, the pasta had cooled. By 10, my patience had hardened into resolve, and I found myself driving toward her office, the takeout bag still sitting untouched on the counter behind me. The building loomed half-lit, an island of fluorescent fatigue against the night sky. I walked to the reception desk and asked if Mara was still inside. The receptionist glanced at her screen, then at me, and delivered the quiet verdict. Mara had left hours ago. Something inside me swayed but did not break. I walked back to my car, texted her casually, still at the office, "Want me to bring food?" and received only silence. So I sat there, watching the parking lot drain of life until only my breath fogged the windshield. Midnight slid into 12:30, and each passing minute was another nail in a coffin I hadn't wanted to build. I drove home slowly, refusing to let suspicion turn into spectacle. The house was quiet when I entered, painfully quiet. I fell asleep on the couch, the television whispering static into the dark. At dawn, I woke and found her in our bed, hair damp, makeup washed away, body curled as though she had been there all night. When I asked, her answer came rehearsed. She had been at the client's U.S. office, working on Asian time. The phrasing was smooth, the explanation almost plausible until I noticed the seams. The next morning, when she realized the receptionist had seen me, her story shifted instantly. Not memory optimization. She wasn't recalling the truth. She was reshaping it, drafting a script where her words might still cover the gaps. And that was when I understood. She was no longer living with me. She was living with her performance. I logged the discrepancy quietly, adding it to the archive I had already begun. Notes, receipts, odometer readings, time stamps. But I gave her no confrontation. Anger, I knew, could be spun into jealousy, into control, into the insecurity of a husband who couldn't handle change. I wouldn't give her that weapon. That afternoon, I scheduled an STD panel. It was a quiet act, bureaucratic and devastating at the same time. Clicking confirm appointment felt like pressing confirm on the truth I had tried so hard to delay. The end was coming. And when it came, it wouldn't arrive with shouting or slammed doors. It would arrive with precision, executed like surgery. That night, while she cleared the table as though dishes could erase suspicion, I sat across from her and realized my role had already changed. I wasn't her husband anymore. I was her witness. It happened on a Wednesday, a night so ordinary it should have carried no danger. Mara was on the bed, her voice soft and measured as she spoke to her mother who had been struggling with health issues. I sat at my desk, answering work emails, pretending focus, though my eyes kept drifting to the nightstand where her phone lay buzzing like a restless insect. At first, I told myself not to care. Notifications stacked one by one, small previews that disappeared before I could read them. Each vibration was subtle, but together they formed a rhythm like a drum beat I wasn't meant to hear. I reminded myself of the boundary I had drawn, proof before rage, precision before noise. And yet when the phone hummed again, my chest tightened as though the device itself were whispering truth she would never speak aloud. When Mara excused herself to the bathroom, still murmuring into her call, she left the phone behind. My pulse kicked hard. I told myself again not to touch it, that privacy was a line even betrayal couldn't justify crossing. But then another buzz lit up the screen. A username I didn't recognize flashed for just an instant, bold and shameless. In that moment, choice evaporated. I picked up the phone and slipped quietly into the bathroom, locking the door behind me. The screen was already open, as if daring me. My hands trembled. My heart pounded against my ribs, every beat a warning. Still, I scrolled. The evidence was there, waiting without apology. Direct messages with interns, playful, brazen, undeniable. Location pins that aligned perfectly with nights she had claimed to be at the office. Photos, explicit and cruel in their casualness, arranged like trophies for a private audience. Each timestamp matched a gap in the archive I had been building. Every message was another confirmation that my instincts had never lied. I felt myself split in two as I read. One part of me was the detective, grimly satisfied at how neatly the puzzle pieces fit. The other was the widower, hollow and staggering at the loss of something sacred. Both men knew the same truth. This wasn't the night to explode. This wasn't the moment for shouting matches or begging for explanations she had already rehearsed. Carefully, I acted with precision. I selected, compressed, and emailed the archive to myself. I watched the progress bar crawl, pixel by pixel, until the truth was safe beyond her reach. Then I erased my tracks, cleared the history, and returned the phone to its place as though it had never left her side. When I looked into the bathroom mirror, I saw the fracture plainly. My face no longer belonged fully to the man who had once believed in vows. It belonged to someone else now, a man who had traded innocence for strategy, who had chosen silence as his weapon. Later that night, when Mara finally returned from her call, I didn't mention the phone. I didn't mention the messages or the photos. Instead, I called Liam, my oldest friend, and asked if we could talk. He didn't offer dramatic sympathy. He offered logistics, a spare room, a lawyer's number, a checklist of accounts to secure, documents to gather, passwords to change. I wrote it all down with a steady hand, though inside I felt the tremor of grief. By the time I hung up, the decision was made. I was no longer simply waiting for the storm. I was preparing my exit, my revenge not in spectacle, but in refusal. Silence, discipline, precision. These would be the tools that carried me forward. That night, I lay on the couch and stared at the ceiling. The house around me felt different, almost complicit, as if it too had read the messages and chosen sides. The messages had been careless, almost smug in their certainty. A time, an address, a hint tucked inside playful banter as if secrecy itself had become part of the thrill. To her, it was a breadcrumb meant for someone else. To me, it was a map. By late afternoon, I was already there, sitting in the dim lounge of a mid-range business hotel whose walls smelled faintly of perfume and disinfectant. The carpet was tired, patterned with stains that told other people's secrets, and the lighting was just bright enough to make no one linger. I chose a table tucked deep in the shadows where I could see both the elevators and the front entrance without being seen. Hours passed in silence. I nursed a glass of water, condensation dripping down like seconds that refused to move. Each time the revolving door spun open, my chest tightened. A salesman on his phone. A family dragging suitcases. A couple laughing too loudly. Strangers living their lives without knowing I was watching for one face, the only face I dreaded and needed to see. At 5:15, the air shifted. Mara stepped inside, wearing a black dress cut for attention. Her hair had been styled carefully, every strand deliberate, every detail chosen for performance. She walked with a confidence that didn't look borrowed, it looked practiced. At the counter, she signed the registry with a flourish, her eyes flicking toward the hallway as though she had rehearsed this exact gesture. The sight of it hollowed me out. It was no longer suspicion, no longer theory. It was script, choreographed. I stood and walked toward her. She turned at the touch of my hand on her shoulder, her face drained first, then flushed with panic. Words gathered in her throat, ready to rearrange themselves into excuses, but I didn't let them breathe. "Good luck with your fun ride," I said quietly. It was not a shout. It was not accusation. It was dismissal, cold, unadorned, and final. Her hand reached instinctively for my arm, a reflex, as if to tether me long enough to spin a new version of the story. I stepped back before she could. There would be no scene for security to break up, no public theater for her to recast me as the jealous husband or controlling villain. Just silence, just distance. I turned and walked through the glass doors. For a moment, my reflection trailed me, two men walking in step, the husband I had been and the stranger I had become. Then the doors closed and the image broke. In the cab, I trembled, not from indecision, but from the adrenaline of clarity. I had seen enough. I had all I needed. There would be no more negotiation, no more wasted breath trying to convince her of vows she had already shredded. That night, as the city lights blurred outside the cab window, I realized something simple but devastating. The marriage wasn't dying. It was already dead. And the only thing left was to decide how I would walk away. Ghosting was never about sulking. Sulking waits to be noticed, a performance of absence. Ghosting, real ghosting, erases the stage altogether. I understood this the moment I stepped out of that hotel lobby. I didn't need to shout, didn't need to drag her home, didn't need to bargain with ashes. What I needed was distance, measured, precise, absolute. That night I packed only what mattered, important documents, a week's worth of clothes, my laptop, nothing sentimental, nothing she could spin into a plea about memories. I left the pasta-stained plates in the sink, the candle stub on the table, the bed still smelling of her perfume. No dramatic suitcase scene, no note left on the counter begging her to understand. Just absence, clean, surgical. I moved into Liam's spare room. The bed there was narrow, the sheets rough, but it was quiet, blessedly quiet. No buzzing phones, no lies rehearsed over dinner plates, just four walls and the sound of my own breathing. From there, I began the quiet work of erasure. Passwords rotated before she realized what doors she no longer had keys to. Bank accounts were frozen or split, credit cards canceled, joint subscriptions rerouted. I stopped forwarding mail. I blocked her number, disabled shared locations, and cut off every digital tether she might use to pull me back into her orbit. Her calls multiplied by the hour. First anger, then bargaining, then begging. Dozens of voicemails spilled into hundreds. I didn't listen to a single one. Instead, I logged them, timestamps only, proof of pursuit without the poison of content. At night, I sometimes felt the tremor of temptation, an urge to answer, to demand why, to let her hear the anger she had earned. But I knew better. Anger is still a kind of tether, a rope she could pull to keep me tied to her play. My silence was not emptiness. It was refusal. Refusal to act in the theater she had written without my consent. I scheduled medical tests, a cold precaution against what her choices might have carried home. I altered my driving routes, not out of fear, but out of discipline. Predictability was no longer my gift. It was my vulnerability. A few trusted colleagues were told just enough to cover my absence at social functions, never enough to feed gossip. One night, Liam asked if I wanted to vent. He was offering me permission to rage, to cry, to crack. I shook my head. Venting would still be performance, still an answer to a stage she had set. My revenge was not to humiliate her, not to punish her with theatrics. It was to vanish, to refuse every line of her script. On my phone, the final act of disappearance was small but absolute. I tapped block this caller, set the device face down on the table, and walked away. The silence that followed was not emptiness, it was armor. And in that silence, I finally heard something I had been missing for months, my own life, unhooked from hers, breathing freely again. The days that followed took on the shape of discipline. I woke before dawn, laced my shoes, and ran until my lungs steadied more than my thoughts. In Liam's spare room, I showered, ate simple meals, and worked through legal checklists like a monk reciting prayers. Bank accounts to freeze, documents to notarize, contingency plans for everything she might try next. At the office, I sharpened my focus until there was no room for distraction. The chaos of my private life was a storm I would not let spill into my professional skin. But silence has a way of provoking noise. Soon the flood began. First came numbers I didn't recognize, texts that started with please, with just one chance, with we can fix this. Then emails arrived, subject lines written like lifelines. I can explain, you don't understand, it's not what you think. Inside, long paragraphs unspooled about exploration, about feeling desirable, about loneliness she claimed I had cornered her into. She twisted her open marriage request into an almost confession, rewriting it as a desperate attempt to save us, rather than the cover for betrayal it had always been. She apologized, but the words bent away from the act itself. She wrote about wanting to feel radiant, about how everybody does this now, about how I was being too rigid. Never once did she use the word affair. Never once did she admit what the photos already screamed. I answered none of it. I didn't argue, didn't bait, didn't let her drag me back into a script I had already exited. Instead, I saved everything, screenshots, PDF, phone logs, all placed neatly in a folder marked for counsel. Proof, not dialogue, evidence, not theater. Still, the waves kept coming, calls multiplied. Messages grew longer, more desperate. Pleas turned to bargaining. Bargaining turned to threats. Threats collapsed back into begging. Mara's voice filled my voicemail box with 1,000 variations of the same theme. Don't leave me, don't silence me, don't erase me. When a mutual friend finally reached out, suggesting mediation, I responded with one sentence. All communication goes through the lawyer. To her, it must have sounded like ice. To me, it was warmth, the only warmth I could afford to give, reserved not for her, but for my future. At night, temptation flickered. I would open one of her emails, let the cursor blink in an empty reply box, feel the gravity of words wanting to be written. But I always closed it, because silence, though heavy, was the only response she could not twist, could not manipulate. My revenge was not her humiliation. It was my refusal to play. Her flood of pleas became noise against stone, crashing endlessly and finding no crack. And in the echo of that silence, I heard myself again. The flood of messages eventually ebbed into silence, but silence has its own echo. It wasn't peace. It was the sound of her running out of scripts she could play alone. And then came the knock, too hesitant to be anger, too firm to be casual. When I opened the door, Claire stood there, Mara's sister. Her hands clutched the strap of her purse like it carried the lines she had rehearsed all the way over. She wore a nervous smile that didn't reach her eyes. She wasn't there as Mara's ally. She was there as the reluctant witness. We sat at Liam's small kitchen table, and for a while she didn't know how to begin. Finally, words came in a rush. She admitted she didn't condone what Mara had done, but she couldn't stand by and watch the unraveling without trying to intervene. She painted the picture in painful detail. The interns Mara had surrounded herself with, young men loud with charisma, orbiting her like moths around a flame. They made her feel desirable again, yes, But the cost of that illusion fell directly on me. Claire's voice trembled as she described the trail Mara had left behind. Restaurant tabs disguised as client dinners. Hotel bills slipped into company expenses. Rideshare charges that stretched across neighborhoods far from the office. Mara hadn't stumbled into love, she had bought into a racket. The interns bragged about their escapades, flaunted photos like trophies, and eventually passed them around. The whispers in her workplace hadn't just started, they had swelled into a roar. By the time Claire spoke to me, Mara had already resigned, unable to endure the stares. I listened quietly, letting her words settle. There was no satisfaction in hearing them, only confirmation. Claire gave me two truths I could use. First, Mara had siphoned marital assets to fund her recklessness, a detail that would matter in court. Second, the leak of those photos hadn't come from me. It had come from the very boys she thought adored her. When Claire finally asked if I would at least consider speaking with her sister, my answer was steady, without cruelty. All communication goes through the lawyer. Her shoulders dropped as if she had expected it. She nodded, stood, and lingered for a moment at the door. "I just didn't want you to think she destroyed only you," she said softly. Then she left. I sat in the quiet afterward, struck by a strange ache. Not for Mara, not for the marriage, for the memory of a woman who had once laughed with me in the hum of our fridge and the tick of our clock. That woman was gone, drowned in the shallow end of her own choices. The ache didn't change my path, but it reminded me of the man I still wanted to be, firm but not cruel, precise but not vindictive. I wasn't here to ruin her. I was here to leave her behind. Whispers move faster than apologies, and in Mara's office the wildfire was already burning long before she smelled the smoke. The photos, once her secret trophies, exchanged like proof of desirability among interns, didn't stay contained. They migrated upward, pixel by pixel, screenshot by screenshot, until supervisors, directors, and eventually senior leadership stared at the evidence no policy could sanitize. By the time word reached me through the cautious filter of my lawyer, the damage was irreversible. HR had moved into crisis mode, their priority less about compassion than liability. Memos about culture shifts and values realignment fluttered through inboxes, corporate platitudes desperately trying to wallpaper over the scandal. Mara tried to seize control of the narrative. She filed a complaint, painting herself as a victim of coercion, describing a toxic culture that blurred lines between mentorship and manipulation. She insisted she had been pressured, cornered, seduced into mistakes she hadn't truly chosen. But data is merciless. Metadata revealed timestamps that aligned with her own invitations. Chat logs captured her arranging encounters, not resisting them. Receipts tied her directly to hotel bills and team nights at clubs she had bankrolled. For every claim of exploitation, there was a screenshot of enthusiasm. The interns, predictably, began turning on each other. Bravado curdled into betrayal. Screenshots meant to impress peers now became evidence. Each boy scrambled to shed responsibility, but in doing so, they confirmed her complicity. And through it all, Mara's name sank deeper into the quicksand. I stayed silent. My name never surfaced. My absence protected me more effectively than any defense ever could. I wasn't the furious husband storming into HR, and I wasn't the anonymous whistleblower leaking documents. I was nothing at all. And in that nothingness, I found armor. The company offered her a choice, resignation or formal termination. Resignation sounded softer, easier to spin for a resume, but everyone knew what it really meant. Overnight, her network evaporated. Calls went unanswered. Emails returned cold or not at all. The same colleagues who once laughed too loudly at her jokes now kept their distance, afraid of contagion by association. From Liam's apartment, I read the summaries my lawyer forwarded, just enough to keep me informed, never enough to tempt me into voyeurism. There was no joy in reading them, no surge of vindictive triumph, only confirmation that I hadn't needed to swing the hammer. The structure was already rotted through. Left to its own devices, truth had walked into the room on its own 2 feet, carrying consequences she could not outrun. And as the scandal devoured her career, I understood something I hadn't dared to admit until then. Sometimes revenge doesn't require fire. Sometimes it's enough to stand back and let the walls collapse under the weight of their own lies. The courtroom smelled faintly of dust and paper, the kind of air that turned every word into record. No laughter, no whispers, no forgiveness, just the low hum of an air conditioner and the echo of shoes across linoleum floors. This was where marriages came not to die, but to be documented. Mara sat across the aisle in a tailored suit, her hair pulled back into a knot so tight it looked like a mask. She carried herself with the posture of someone rehearsing for sympathy. When the judge called the session to order, her attorney stood quickly, eager to frame the narrative. He painted me as a husband who withheld intimacy, who clung to outdated ideals, who left his wife starving for affection until she sought it elsewhere. He repeated the word neglect until it felt like a drumbeat in the room. Each repetition was an attempt to shift the weight of her choices onto my shoulders, to recast betrayal as survival. I didn't flinch. My lawyer, calm and deliberate, waited for the performance to end before unspooling the counterweight. Bank statements surfaced first, charges for hotels and luxury dinners, each date aligning neatly with her messages and the intern's boasts. Rideshare logs followed, pickups miles from her office on nights she had sworn she was still at work. Door camera footage marked her arrivals long after her supposed meetings. Finally, the hotel registry itself, her name, dated and signed in ink she could not deny. The phrase dissipation of marital assets landed like a hammer. It reframed everything, not romance, not confusion, but reckless theft of resources meant for both of us. She hadn't just betrayed vows. She had siphoned the future we built together into the shallow theater of her illusions. Her attorney tried one last maneuver. He raised the subject of our conversation about open marriage. Hadn't I once entertained it? Hadn't I, by not leaving the room immediately, given tacit consent? The implication was desperate, that I had opened the door and she had merely walked through it. But my notes, dated, consistent, meticulous, told the truth. Every refusal, every line drawn, recorded before her betrayal surfaced, proof that her acts had come first and her excuses came later. The theater collapsed under the weight of receipts. For a long moment, the room held only silence. Even the air conditioner seemed to pause. The judge leaned back, eyes steady, and when he finally spoke, it wasn't with drama or flourish. It was with the flat, irrevocable authority of the state. His words didn't rage or console. They cut, clean and final. As the ruling was delivered, Mara stared straight ahead, her face a mask that betrayed nothing and everything all at once. I didn't celebrate. I didn't smirk. I simply breathed. Because in that room, the story wasn't hers anymore. It wasn't mine either. It belonged to the record. And sometimes the record is the only truth that matters. When the gavel struck, the story shrank into paperwork. Years of marriage, a decade of love and erosion, reduced to forms, signatures, initials, and stamps. Divorce decrees that once might have felt like death now resembled inventory sheets. Who kept the furniture, who lost the accounts, who signed away the keys. It was the quiet dismantling of a stage set after the audience had gone home. Mara tried to re-enter the script with a new role. Through friends, cousins, even Claire again, she sent messages heavy with revision. Words soaked in shame, dressed in self-pity, recast not as excuses but as explanations. She wasn't defending herself, she insisted, only contextualizing. She spoke of depression, of sleepless nights, of the cruelty of gossip that trailed her like a shadow. She wanted me to acknowledge that the punishment had become heavier than the crime. But protecting her reputation was no longer my role. Protecting my peace was. When rumors briefly surfaced online, anonymous posts whispering that I had been controlling, that my coldness had driven her into reckless arms, I still did not speak. I didn't write rebuttals. I didn't feed the fire with my side of the story. Instead, Liam's recommended law firm sent a short letter with long teeth, and the gossip evaporated in hours. That was when I learned the paradox of silence. Not answering hurt more than any crafted speech. My refusal to engage left her suspended in her own story, unable to stitch her wounds closed with my words. She could deny accusations, she could rewrite events, she could call herself misunderstood, but she could not bend silence. I didn't want her ruined. I didn't even want her punished anymore. What I wanted was oxygen, a life unhooked from hers where every breath wasn't laced with performance. Closure didn't arrive as a dramatic moment. It came in the slow accumulation of finalities. Keys exchanged for receipts, passwords reset, accounts dissolved. One afternoon, I sat in a banker's office, signed the last form, and watched as the clerk stamped the page with a dull, echoing thud. That sound, not her apologies, not her collapse, was what told me it was finally over. And when I stepped outside into the sunlight, I realized the silence wasn't empty anymore. It was space. Space wide enough for me to rebuild. After the dust of court settled, friends leaned in with curiosity. They wanted the scandal in digestible bites, a story to pass along at dinners and in whispered phone calls, but I gave them nothing. I didn't hand out gossip. I didn't offer her mistakes as entertainment. I answered with dates, with boundaries, with exits, facts stripped of performance, numbers without venom. It was enough to satisfy curiosity, but not enough to feed the rumor mill. In the privacy of Liam's apartment, I began a different project. A document I came to call my counter-story. It wasn't a memoir, and it wasn't written for public consumption. It was clarity on paper, a way of ensuring that truth would not be eroded by time or by her inevitable rewrites. I started with the beginning, the night she set down her mug and proposed an open marriage. I recorded my response, steady and consistent each time. No, not a maybe, not a hesitation, a firm line in the sand. I mapped the timeline, marking how her request came after the acts, not before. The pattern was undeniable. Into the pages, I added details no one else would ever see. Her perfumed coats that carried stories the receipts confirmed. The odometer readings in the garage. The timestamps that lined up too perfectly with the photos she had shared with boys young enough to still be celebrating internships. Each fragment became a stitch in a tapestry of truth. I included one voicemail, too, a benign tone with devastating implication. In it, Mara used the word open not as a plan, but as a lifeline, spoken after discovery, not before. Her voice trembled not with strategy, but with desperation, as if naming it exploration could retroactively sanctify betrayal. That single recording destroyed the myth she might later weave, that I had ever consented, that I had ever pushed her into this world. The counter-story wasn't meant to humiliate her. It wasn't even designed to fight her. It was a mirror, something I could hold up if I ever needed to defend myself to future children who might one day ask questions, or to an employer who might stumble across the whispers. It was a way to ensure that truth lived outside of memory, safe from erosion, safe from doubt. When I finished, I printed the pages, slid them into a folder, and wrote a single word across the front in block letters. Personal. I carried it to my attorney's office, placed it in his safe, and walked away lighter. The counter-story was not a weapon. It was insurance, a quiet guarantee that whatever version she tried to script next, my truth already existed, complete, dated, undeniable. And for the first time in months, I didn't feel the need to speak. The silence I kept was no longer defensive. It was chosen. It was strength. Rebuilding didn't arrive with trumpets. It came quietly, in rhythms so ordinary they almost felt invisible. For the first time in years, my days belonged only to me. Tuesdays were reserved for therapy, where I sat across from a woman who asked questions that stung like antiseptic. Her voice guided me to stitch wounds into sentences, turning pain into something I could finally hold without bleeding. Thursdays belonged to iron and sweat. At the gym, I gripped the barbell, the weight groaning against gravity, and felt my body remember its strength even as my mind relearned steadiness. Mornings carried their own lessons. On days when the sky couldn't decide between gray and blue, I laced my shoes and ran until my lungs burned clean. Each footfall was an argument with the past, each breath a small victory against the gravity of memory. Evenings were quieter. I cooked meals without audience, scrambled eggs, grilled chicken, vegetables glossed in olive oil, food that didn't need applause, only nourishment. Slowly, the apartment I had borrowed became a home. I replaced the dying plant by Liam's window with a spider fern, watered it weekly, and marveled at how something so small could green an entire room. The silence that once felt punishing began to soften, reshaping itself into peace. And then one morning, a friend introduced me to someone new. Claire's colleague, kind, intelligent, steady in her words. We met over coffee, and I surprised myself by laughing at something simple she said. I didn't confess old wounds. I didn't draft a future over one latte. I simply listened, letting the conversation breathe. For once, attention wasn't a stage or a performance. It was just two people sharing air. The victories were modest but cumulative, falling asleep without wine, waking without dread, telling a joke and laughing before checking if it landed. Even work became sharper, steadier, no longer shadowed by the dread of what I might uncover at home. I stopped chasing the idea of a happy ending. What I built instead was a true middle, a life balanced on choice, rhythm, and quiet dignity. For the first time in months, I wasn't surviving someone else's chaos. I was living my own order. And in that quiet order, I discovered a freedom far greater than revenge. Months later, the noise had drained away. What remained was distilled clarity, the kind that arrives only after fire has finished its work. Betrayal, I learned, is not a single act but a teacher, a cruel instructor who grades on a curve. You don't pass by punishing the other person. You pass by refusing to cheat on yourself. It took me time to see that open marriage was never the sin. The sin was the lie, the sequence, the performance that turned vows into theater. Her betrayal hadn't been about curiosity or exploration. It had been about rewriting the script without my consent. My revenge worked not because it broke her, but because it ended the play. I stepped off the stage, leaving her to clap for herself in an empty theater. Boundaries became my rituals. Say yes when you mean yes. Say no when you mean no. Exit cleanly when the contract is rewritten without your signature. They weren't just rules for marriage. They were rules for work, for friendship, for every place where trust lives or dies. When I finally spoke aloud about Mara, it wasn't at a bar with friends eager for gossip. It wasn't to colleagues curious about scandal. It was in my therapist's office, where words were treated like wounds that could be cleaned instead of spectacles to be passed around. Months later still, I told the story once more, this time to a woman I had begun to care for. She hadn't asked for it, but she deserved context. I didn't name Mara, I named the pattern. I kept the past the size it deserved to be, a chapter, not the book, and the silence that once felt like a weapon became something else entirely, a room with windows. On a spring morning, I opened one, breathed deeply, and felt the air inside match the air outside. For the first time in years, the future didn't feel like survival. It felt like alignment. That was the final lesson. Revenge hadn't been about her collapse. It had been about my return. And so Ethan's silence became the sharpest answer of all. He didn't shout, he didn't beg. He simply walked away and left Mara clapping in an empty theater. Her betrayal collapsed under its own weight, while his revenge was to live without lies. Because sometimes the truest victory isn't punishment, it's freedom. What would you have done in Ethan's place? Could you walk away quietly, or would you confront her head-on? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective. This has been another unforgettable story on Cheating Stories 7. If you found it powerful, please like, comment, and subscribe to support the channel and join us for more. Until next time, remember, betrayal has a price and truth always finds a way.